We're going to talk about the last quarter century or so of Stanley Kubrick's life, and I guess before we get into the film, the films he actually did, let's just review just quickly for a couple of minutes some of the projects. So I know Kubrick had the famous Napoleon film that failed. There was the Holocaust film. He originally had the rights to AI and then passed it on to Steven Spielberg. So maybe Jeffrey, I don't know if you know about those films. The Napoleon film I know was sort of kiboshed because a similar film came out, and I guess they thought his film was too expensive. Was that the main reason?
Right. This was just about the time that studios were beginning to lose money on big productions. It was the change in the audience and the culture toward more independent films, more modest films that had more to say. And in some ways, as you know, the 1970s was a golden age of American filmmaking in particular. And these big studio productions were simply falling out of favor. So, as I understand it, Kubrick couldn't get the financing for this film. And he did all this research, as you know, and he just simply had to leave it alone. As far as his film about began working on, he wrote a screenplay of Louis Begley's fictionalized memoir, Wartime Lies, and he was working on this in the 1990s. And he ostensibly decided not to film it because he felt that Spielberg's Schindler's List had preempted the need for a Holocaust film at that juncture from him. I'm dubious about that as cause and effect or even as a significant condition because Kubrick later told Frederick Raphael that he didn't like Schindler's List because he said Schindler's List is about 600 Jews who are saved. The Holocaust is about 6 million who get killed. It's not a Holocaust film. And so I think his failure to make that film of Wartime Lies, which was to be called Aryan Papers, had more to do with his own personal and aesthetic reasons for not wanting to make a Holocaust film, or at least a film that addressed the Holocaust directly. And it's interesting that Wartime Lies is, of course, is a Holocaust novel, in that it was a novel about the author's own experience as a hidden child in Poland. But it's indirect in that it isn't about the Holocaust because he survived and he was not in the camps. He was hidden and survived the war. So it would have been an indirect look at the Holocaust, which I think was important to Kubrick. And yet, at the same time, I think Kubrick, for aesthetic and personal reasons, couldn't bring himself to make a Holocaust film. He once said that what he probably most wanted to make was a Holocaust film, but good luck of putting all that into a 2-hour movie. I think he felt that form was insufficient.
Well, before we get to AI, let me just ask you a question, or two questions, because you mentioned Spielberg, and this is one of the things that I think didn't come out until after Kubrick's death was the relationship between Spielberg and Kubrick. And nothing against Steven Spielberg as a person, but it's always been unfathomable to me to see these two men together, because Spielberg is sort of the Heider Schmaltz. He's the feel-good E.T. kind of guy, and here Kubrick is this vast intellect, this guy, and that like you said, that his version of the film, of the Holocaust film versus Schindler's List. Well, if you look at AI, I can't imagine. I mean, AI is one of Spielberg's better films, but I don't think it's anywhere near a great film. I can imagine, though, what Kubrick would have done with it. It just seems unimaginable that these two polar opposites would have been sort of running buddies. But then again, I've heard that Bergman said a lot of bad things about Antonioni, whereas I think those two, their view on humanity, are two peas in a pod. But what is your comment about that, since you brought that up, Jeffrey?
Well, I don't know, but I suspect that Spielberg and Kubrick were united by the fact that they're both Jewish. And at the time that they were working together, there was a greater consciousness about the Holocaust and about the position of Jews in the world, past, present, and future. And Kubrick gave Spielberg AI because he finally decided that it wasn't really a film that he could make, that the subject matter was interesting and challenging, but he didn't really feel it would be a film that would represent his view of the world. And so I think he gave it to Spielberg, and it does represent Spielberg's view of the world, the incredibly sentimental ending, which works for me. I find myself crying at the end of the film, but they're very much sort of programmed tears. Is that, you know, a kid with his mother and he's going to die and not wake up, and she's going to go to sleep and not wake up, and it's very sentimental. But it's sentimental in a sort of thin, predictable, conventional sense. Kubrick, you can imagine the ending Kubrick would have had. There would have been somebody else in the bed, and who knows.
Well, let's turn to Barry Lyndon, but before I do, one last comment. I always thought, and I don't know if either of you have seen this film, in the late 60s, Luchino Visconti made a film about the Nazis called The Damned, and it's an over-the-top, campy melodrama. But I think that had Kubrick made a film, he could have taken that basic same subject matter within Kristallnacht, and he could have done something that, I mean, he could have put a real acidic view on that that kind of subject matter that Visconti I don't think could have touched. So I think I think if Kubrick was going to have done the Aryan Papers, I think he probably would have gone sort of a more serious version of Visconti's The Damned. I don't know if you've seen it, but
yes, you're right.
Well, let's turn Darren, because I know you said you recently watched or just today watched parts of Barry Lyndon. Now, this is one of those films that sort of, if you look at the three films, especially that preceded, it seems to come out of nowhere. It seems a film that has no ties to the prior run of three, Titanic films. Is that a wrong impression, do you think, Darren? Are there things cinematically that tie them together?
No, well, Barry Lyndon's it's a really strange film because it must be one of the most underrated Kubrick films and one of the most least watched Kubrick films. And it's not because it's any drop in standard filmmaking or story-wise. It's probably due to the fact that it's like a 3-hour period piece, and most Kubrick films require multiple viewings. So it's just not that user-friendly when it comes to multiple viewings. That's probably why people haven't made videos on it, write blog posts, and have fan iconic imagery from it. But the film, I watched that again today, and it's a really smart character study. It's an incredibly gorgeous film, and it's a really fantastic story about fathers and sons, and about this kind of social ladder. And there's so much going on that's very Kubrickian, and there's so much going on in terms of what he does with this form in his later films that is there also. For some reason, just some of the subject matter hasn't really connected with some people, and it seems to be a less popular film of his.
Well, I think to a certain extent, my own take on it is, it seems to be the film that it actually fulfills most of the characterizations that are wrong in other Kubrick, about other Kubrick films here, because like Marissa Berenson, she's gorgeous to look at, but she's a model, and she's sort of like this perfect wax doll figure, and it's hard to get into her. Ryan O'Neal is a real actor, and you could get that. Then you have the two kids as boys, and it's almost like he's doing a Punch and Judy show, or one of these old sort of marionette kind of shows. Jeffrey, do you get that sense of that with that film, or what are your take on Barry Lyndon?
I regularly teach a Kubrick course of one kind or another, and so I see Barry Lyndon on a fairly regular basis. And like most everybody else, it was the Kubrick film I didn't go to see in the theater. I went right from A Clockwork Orange to The Shining. And yet every time I see Barry Lyndon, not only am I impressed with what Darren talked about the beauty of the cinematography and the composition and its deliberation upon the dying of an 18th century culture on the cusp of a new and even more dangerous modern world, what I find is that it's an incredibly moving story, an incredibly sad story about human beings and their ambitions and their flaws and their failures and their regrets. And so in some ways, I think it's just as good a film as any that Kubrick made. And there's another thing about it that fits it into Kubrick films from Lolita on, at least through The Shining, and that is this arc of films from Lolita through The Shining at the least displays a trope, and it's a crucial trope in Kubrick filmography. And the trope is of a young person, child, young adult, adolescent, confronting a dangerous world. And this unites Lolita, who's exploited by adults. It goes right through Dr. Strangelove, in which there's this projection of new Nazi youth coming to inherit the earth. And then The Star Child in 2001, A New Beginning, and that's ambiguously presented. And then, of course, Clockwork Orange, Alex, who's a young boy who's out of control, but yet at the end is manipulated and used. And then Barry Lyndon, Barry, a very flawed person, but an extremely corrupt and violent aristocratic establishment that finally destroys him, which gives the ending of the film real sentimental weight. And then, of course, The Shining, which is about the young boy Danny, who literally is exposed to the reality of the world through his ability to shine and see past, present, and future. So I think Barry Lyndon is important for those two reasons, because it engages our sympathy, like the sympathy we had for Humbert Humbert, and it also represents another stage in this arc of films that show this trope of the young, innocent child confronting the world in which he or will have to live.
And I think the fellow who played the son of Marissa Berenson later became one of Kubrick's like executive assistants throughout the rest of his career. So any final comments from either of you then about Barry Lyndon, or can we move on to The Shining?
I was just going to say about Barry Lyndon, how we were talking about the character, and there's very much like a repetition in terms of the form of that film, even with the fact that it's got part 1 and part 2 and the intermission in the middle, and it's the rise and the fall of this character. And Barry's character at the beginning of the film with so much rebellious nature against authority and older figures, that gets reflected back at him when his stepson almost shows the same nature that brings him down at the end of the film. And it's got this lovely kind of symmetry where it's almost a similar version of a younger version of himself that kind of destroys his very nature at the end of the film. And there's a kind of lovely symmetry in that, you know.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, let's move on to The Shining, and if you look below this video, I'll have links to some of the videos on Vimeo and YouTube and whatnot that Darren has, and one of his videos is specifically his theory about The Shining, and I didn't mention it and anything particular about it, and I don't think Jeffrey will know. So let me turn to Darren. You have it. I think it's 10 or 12-minute video. Your theory about the way that Kubrick matched beginning and ending shots to some end. So before we talk about the film proper, if you could summarize your thesis and your film analysis.
Yeah, well, for some reason, it seems to have been like 30 years of a film's release from a Kubrick film to really gain some conversation on film. So The Shining has been out for 30 years, and then all of a sudden with this Room 237 documentary, it's gained a lot of attention, a lot of buzz about different interpretations of the film, and there seems to be all these sorts of ideas. So as I was kind of researching and exploring what other people were thinking, it was just there were so many questions that come up, and it was just through my own effort to try and answer some of these questions. And so one of the things that I was wondering about was there's a really interesting jump cut that they use in the bathroom scene when Jack Nicholson goes in and...
Could you speak up a little bit, Darren? Just speak up a little.
Sorry. Moved a little bit away from the computer. When Jack Nicholson goes into the bathroom and meets the young woman for the first time, and she transforms into the old woman, there's a jump cut that cuts back to the old woman in the bathtub. And it's the first time within the whole film that you really see any cinematic manipulation by Kubrick to kind of cut back and forward for those kind of things, because he doesn't use that throughout the film at all to scare people or to manipulate the audience. It's a very straight film in that way, so it feels a little bit out of place. So if you watch that scene literally, there's a woman walking towards Jack, and then there's a woman rising from the bathtub. So, in my opinion, there are really two women in the bathtub. And so two matching women would connect with where do we see like another set of two matching women in the film? It's the twins. Now this kind of ties in with when Danny first is on his little bike and he goes past the room 237 and he stops and looks at the doorway. We see a little flash image of the twins, kind of as a connection to danger for that room. But it's the twins that we see within overlaid on top of the room 237. So the theory and the idea was kind of idea of there's this lineage between Grady and his daughters that's kind of coming into Jack and his son, and that maybe one day Danny will do with his family, and it's this kind of tragedy that's going on through these families. And for me, it was Danny that broke the cycle. And the thing that got me thinking about that was the deleted ending from this film where you see Danny and his wife in the hospital, and the caretaker comes back and gives Danny the tennis ball that Jack was throwing against the wall. And it was almost that kind of subtle hint that your time will come and yes, the cycle will repeat. But the way that the film ends at the moment, it's almost the cycle has been broken and Danny has made it away free. So that's kind of the sum up of where the ideas I was playing with in the video. But there's so much being discovered in The Shining that I wouldn't be surprised there would be more stuff in a few years. It seems to be getting more and more as the film comes out.
Well, let me just ask you, didn't you also try to match up like the first and the last shots and the second shot and second to the last shot somehow?
Yeah, well, I've seen it out before where people have put they've overlaid the film in reverse on top of the film going forward, so you see the ending of the film at the beginning of the film, and it may just be to do with the fact that Kubrick is very cinematic and he knows photography well, that all of his shots just happen to go gorgeously over the top of each other, but some of them actually give more meaning. So a lot of times when you see Jack, you see Danny overlaid each other. A lot of times when you see Grady, you see the twins, and so there's a lot of incidental things that kind of tie up with each other, but it can be completely accurate because there are different timelines for that film depending if you're in the UK or if you're in the US. So it's not completely accurate, but it's another interesting thing about this show.
Yeah, I know what the thing when I first saw that video, I thought my own, I don't know, there's a term called pareidolia, and it's basically human beings tend to see patterns, like there's the famous face on Mars, and I think if you take any work, for example, if you were to take Moby Dick and try to compare the first and last chapter, the second and the second to last chapter, you're going to find some things. But when you're dealing with an artist, I think, you're going to have these running threads, so it's inevitable that you're going to get something. And I think sometimes you can imbue too much into what you're thinking, because while I agreed with some of the things that you'd mentioned previously about Danny and the cycle repeating, I thought it was a bit over a little bit too much of a reach to try to, because I think there was one thing you had with Jack, and then there was, if you overlaid it and there was like a slashing motion through it or whatnot, and I just think that sometimes you can go too far and imbue too much into it. And I think sometimes that's what a lot of people have done with Kubrick, especially when they made these claims about him not being an emotional filmmaker. But anyway, that was his theory, Jeffrey, about Danny and the speaking of Nietzsche and eternal recurrence. What is your take on the story? Because like The Shining, and they remade that I think 5 or 6 years ago on a cable film or something, and Kubrick's version of the tale is so much better than the original story. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. King later made his own television version,
Yeah.
and it's pretty much his book, and it's capable, but it's just a horror story. Kubrick's film is not a horror film, it's a film about horror, and it's a film about the human condition. And to the extent that I'm famous or infamous, it has to do with my ideas that there is a very strong subtext on the Holocaust in The Shining, and I'm one of the unseen talking heads in room 237. And a lot of people have dismissed all the ideas in that film as crazy or the product of conspiracy theorists. And while I'm not on board with all of the theories presented in that film, I rather like my own. And I rather like the view of Bill Blakemore, which coincides with my own, because he sees, I think, something that's more obvious than the pattern I see. Constant oral and visual reference to the decimation of the American Indians, the Native Americans, by European settlers. In any case, The Shining was the film that first indicated to me that I was interested in Kubrick. And as I watched that film, I decided that I needed to find out more about Kubrick. And so I went in and I looked at his past and his times and his career and his concerns. And I think, you know, that sort of context is crucial for understanding anyone and the work that they do, especially when it comes to someone as productive and as thoughtful and as observant as Kubrick. And so I discovered, for example, that he's Jewish and that he was descended from a family that had emigrated from southeastern Poland at the turn of the century, and that all of his relatives who stayed in Poland, of course, were slaughtered in the Holocaust. And that he, as a young boy, he was born in 1928, which made him 14 in 1942, the worst year of the Holocaust. He grew up at a time when to be a Jew in the world was to be subject to not just the threat, but the reality. And I think this underlay his rather sober view of the human prospect. And I think, for the reasons we discussed before about him being hesitant about making a film directly about the Holocaust, I think the result was that it came through indirectly in a number of films like Dr. Strangelove. And then for a number of reasons, I think it came through most powerfully in The Shining. Because The Shining is, of course, a film, and Darren rightly observed earlier that he used a number of different genres. He wanted to show his mastery in all genres. And so in the 1970s, horror films were extremely popular, and so he did his take on horror films, and he changed the emphasis. This isn't about the supernatural. This is about what we do to ourselves and the history of our the horrible things that we do to each other. And I think we can get into the details to some extent if you like, but I think there is definitely a subtext on the Holocaust, a visual and oral subtext in the Holocaust that fits in very well with the overall subject matter of the film in Kubrick's hands.
So I take it, Jeffrey, you then take the things that go on at the hotel as being external projections of Jack's psyche? Is that what I'm getting from you?
I think it has more to do with the hotel itself, that the hotel, like any large institution in Kubrick film, like the Chateau d'Aigle in Paths of Glory, or the Somerton Mansion in Eyes Wide Shut, these large institutions, like the motel in Hitchcock's Psycho, are representations of human power and what powerful people do to those without power, what majorities do to minorities. And I think that's clear in the text of the film having to do with Native Americans, which is very evident because the film is set in Colorado and there are decorations and references to Native Americans throughout the film. But I think also there's a deeper subtext that has to do with the extermination. And it's manifested in objects and in colors and in the music that Kubrick chooses in a very indirect, subliminal fashion that met his own personal and aesthetic reservations about treating the subject, but which also invite the audience to look deeper into the film. And as Darren said, make it your own thought so that it means something to you and you can see what you think about it.
Let me just ask you, you had mentioned at the beginning of this interview that you had seen, I think, in the theater, Strangelove in 2001. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Were you a teenager then? So The Shining, then I guess you were in academia then? Was that then the first film that hit you then? So is this sort of your touchstone film for you?
Right, you're right. By the time The Shining came out in 1980, I had earned a PhD. And I had written a dissertation on the history of psychotherapy in Nazi Germany, and I was well-versed in the history of Nazi Germany, almost as well-versed, or probably even more well-versed than Kubrick was. Kubrick once said that he had never seen a history of Nazi Germany he didn't like. He was fascinated with the subject. And of course, you may know that Christiane Harlan was the niece of the most infamous of the Nazi film directors, Schneider, who produced and directed the film Jew Seuss. And Kubrick wanted to make a film about him, but perhaps characteristically never did. You know, the Nazi beast was represented within his own extended in-law family. And so I think the fact that he was ambivalent about making a film about it made it even more likely that it would manifest itself indirectly in other films that he made. And I think he probably thought, at one level of consciousness or another, that a horror film is the perfect genre in which to present the Holocaust indirectly. There's been a lot of literature since about how horror films, especially horror films made by Jewish directors in the 70s and 80s, are an appropriate way of indirectly treating the Holocaust and real horror in human life. So I think Kubrick was in that tradition.
Was this? I think this film was received better than the previous few films critically, but I don't think it was thought of as deep a film as the analysis. I mean, I think it was thought of as scary and an effective film, but I don't think people necessarily saw it that much different than, say, I guess it was Halloween kind of film that came out a couple of years earlier. But what was the critical reaction to this film overall, do you think?
I think people were underwhelmed. I know I was disappointed. I thought, oh, Kubrick film, this will be something. And of course, I was drawn in by very effective ads that they had on television, which just had that elevator door sliding slowly open and this huge flood of blood coming out of the elevator. I thought, well, that looks cool. It was sort of the adolescent boy in me. So I'll go see it. And I thought, and then I realized it's a Kubrick film. You're going to have to go back and see it again because there's going to be a lot going on in there. And if you go back, and it's the film perhaps more than any other in which he uses just objects in the foreground and in the background of scenes to communicate meaning and to suggest ideas and to prompt the audience to think and reflect on the film and its subject matter.
Any final comments on this before we move on to Full Metal Jacket, Darren?
Just the fact that it was such a different way to approach a horror film at that time. A lot of the way that people did it up to that point was kind of jump scares and cinematic manipulation of trying to move an audience, whereas this film used much more subliminal techniques to try and just get a certain type of feeling across to an audience, and that was part of the scare. So a lot of horror films are in dark, horrible places and things jump out, whereas this is in a brightly lit hotel where you can see everything, and that's half the scariness, that you can see everything and you're still panicked by the edginess that you feel because of the atmosphere created in this place. And I've also seen a few reviewers from the time say that they were very underwhelmed that it was a miss by Kubrick and he couldn't quite hit the horror genre, but it's taken a lot of time for reflection for it to really kind of come out and get some awareness again.
Well, could I just add one more thing? And it's also a film that, not just because of the appearance of Asher's documentary, Room 237, it's also a film that other filmmakers have referenced. Atom Egoyan, in his film The Sweet Hereafter, he opens that film, which is about a deeply dysfunctional family. He opens that film with a helicopter shot of a yellow school bus traveling on the Serpentine Road up to somewhere. And he said that I got the idea from The Shining, Jack's yellow Volkswagen, the idea that here you have this symbol of innocence, a yellow school bus, going somewhere. And where it's going is not what you would normally associate with the innocence of yellow school buses. And that's very much a reference. This may be completely off, but I just saw a film. What was it? Inherent Vice, which is Paul Thomas Anderson's filming. I think it's a wonderful film of Thomas Pynchon's novel. And there's just a quick reference in there. There's this character named Adrian Prussia, who's a mobster, and he carries baseball bats around that he uses to bludgeon people he doesn't like. And he mentions just casually that he used this one particular special bat he had to kill this one character who's a part of the plot of Inherent Vice. And he says it was a special Carl Yastrzemski model. Now that may be completely incidental, but it is a Carl Yastrzemski bat that Wendy wields in The Shining that I argue that is part of the reference to Poland and the Holocaust and German typewriters and the number 42. So you find these reflect, I think the fact that Kubrick has power in that these references end up in other films. Barton Fink, for example, the Coen Brothers film, is quite clearly an homage to The Shining. Of the stain brings in his film at all sorts of levels.
Well, let's move on to the next film. And speaking of documentaries, I had seen a few months back, I think it was on Netflix or maybe it was on YouTube or something. There was a documentary about Full Metal Jacket from the point of view of Matthew Modine, the star of that movie. And you know, this is a film that basically, famously, is split in half. Part of it, the first half, is on Paris Island and ends with the death and suicide of two of the characters, and then we get, I wouldn't say a standard war film, but we get the Vietnam War. It's almost chorus anti-chorus, and so let's talk about that film. The most famous anecdote, of course, is that there was an actor hired to play Sergeant. Is it Hart, I think, or Hartman? Yeah. And then the guy who was training him, Lee Ermey, was just so good in coming up with these dirty things, I don't know, but I've been told Eskimo pussy's mighty cold kind of thing. So maybe Jeffrey, talk about that gestating in Kubrick. Was that like a 20-year gestation period? That from his first idea to do a Vietnam film.
I'm not sure, but I think he must have. If we go back and we look at Kubrick's scattered observations about American policy in the 60s and 70s, and his comments on Vietnam, you can find them in the late 60s, early 70s. He's very skeptical because he sees this as wrong-headed, and he sees this as another matter of a government with tremendous power to wield that power without thought or reflection and without consideration of larger and more important issues. And so I think in a way it was gestating in his mind for a long time. And then he found this marvelous book, The Short Timers, which unfortunately is still out of print, which is a wonderful novel based upon the author's own experience as a Vietnam veteran with the Marines, and is a very realistic portrayal of training and deployment in Vietnam. And the thing is about that second part, that first part is all about destroying the humanity within these recruits, these young boys, and among other things, making them hate women and denigrate women, including their mothers and Virgin Mary and their sisters and everybody else as part of this hyper-masculinity. And then, of course, the second half of the film begins with a prostitute in Vietnam tricking these guys to the strains of Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Are Made for Walking." And then the film ends with a young Vietnamese female sniper picking off these guys one by one. And then they finally kill her in a room of fire and cement in which ornamental swastikas appear throughout the grill work, in the decoration and in the setting. So I think we have another instance here of hypermasculinity and the question of sexuality. And one thing I wanted to mention, Kubrick has often been criticized for his treatment or non-treatment of women, and there may be some justification for that. His films are mostly about men, by a man, but yet I think he is very critical of men, and I think he has a great sympathy for women as like homosexuals and like racial minorities who have been put upon by men. And I think in some ways, the few women that appear in his films are very strong. When you think about Wendy in The Shining, compared to Wendy in King's The Shining, she's just this bombshell who's married to this loser Jack, and she sort of runs around doing nothing. Whereas Wendy in the film, she's played as this dip by Shelley Duvall, who seems completely clueless, And yet she's the one who actually runs the hotel and keeps an eye on the boilers and everything else. And she arguably, at the end, as I think Darren mentioned, she escapes with Danny after defeating Jack. And so she's a very strong woman. But of course, typical Kubrick, she's not portrayed as strong. She's just portrayed as this human being trying to do the best she can under extremely adverse circumstances. So I think there's some of that in Full Metal Jacket as well. Again, the power of women over men.
Darren, any comments on Full Metal Jacket?
The problem I had with the film originally was the fact that it felt like it was so severed in half and like it was really two different films. Then I came across the theory that your main character from Gomer Pyle from the first half of the film, there's this theory that he was kind of born again in the second half of the film as this was animal killer. What's that character?
Animal Mother.
Yeah, and that he's the reincarnation of the trained version of Gomer Pyle, and the sequence where he shoots himself and shoots the sergeant is almost like a dream sequence because it happens in that kind of glossed over blue nighttime sequence. And so once you kind of use that as connective tissue together, and it made a lot more sense for me, the whole film, because it talks about the whole character evolution at the beginning of the film is trying to train him to become a killer, to become somebody who only sees people as things to be killed, and the tenacity from the sergeant to just transform this guy is what actually happens in the middle of the film. And so we see really a completely physical version of this character and kind of reincarnated through a very similar looking but almost a little more athletic looking actor in the second half of the film. And so that kind of helped me join a bit of the connective tissues together.
The thing that got me was there's and certainly I'm sure that Jeffrey knows the mask effect, where people will do things when they're wearing a mask that they won't when their identities are exposed. This explains the troll phenomenon online. And when you think about it, I don't think any of the recruits, do we know any of the names? There's Private Joker, Private Snowball, Gomer Pyle, Animal Mother. All of these young men that, as Jeffrey, you said, have been trained to kill, they've lost their names. They're not individuals. They're all wearing this mask of whether it's a comic, a put down, whether it's Private Joker. So they're doing these things and they're put out into this situation, and they aren't themselves in a sense. I mean, they're trained to be, and it goes back to Alex, and it also I think prefigures what comes in his final film, Eyes Wide Shut, where they're literally wearing masks. Yeah. Any comments on that, Jeffrey?
Well, yes. In the book, you're introduced to these guys with their real names. Like I think Joker's name is James Davis or something, and you get a sort of standard biography of him as a kid, and then his transformation into a Marine. But Kubrick, you're right, just presents them in the form in which they're being molded by Sergeant Hartman.
Yeah.
It's this destruction of individuality and humanity that Kubrick finds so distressing. And I like that. I hadn't thought of that idea about Animal Mother being a manifestation of Gomer Pyle. The guy who can't do anything except, it turns out he's a very good marksman and he'll make a great killer, and he ends up killing himself. Yeah. But then Animal Mother is there and says, there's the final iteration. And Animal Mother survives.
Yeah.
And it just says something about what you were talking about, the characters, they lose their names, and it's almost like a loss of identity for these characters. But even the opening shots of the film is they get their heads shaved, so it's trying to take away all of the humanity of these characters and make them just neutral cogs in this machine so that they can churn out soldiers for the war. So they're trying to strip away as much humanity from them as possible, and it's that process that you see at the beginning of the film.
And I think this was another film that got mixed reviews, but mostly negative upon its release, didn't it, Jeffrey?
I think that's right. I remember I went and saw it, and I thought, well, it's a very small film. But again, as I thought more about it, as usual, Kubrick had me. And the more you look at it, the more you find. It appears small. It doesn't seem to have the grandiosity of Platoon or Apocalypse Now. Certainly, the most operatic qualities of that film, but yet it's very, very accurate in terms of how it presents the training and the actual experience in Vietnam, and then makes poetry about it.
Yeah,
I think Kubrick's films were once called poetic realism.
yeah.
I think that's a very good way of putting it.
And the thing is too is that it seems almost that the Vietnam half is almost a little bit off from reality, whereas there seems to be a hyper reality to Paris Island. For example, there's that famous thing where you see the documentary crew wheeling the camera, and they start talking, saying things in like that Burma shave kind of way, you know. But anyway, let's go to the last film, because this Eyes Wide Shut probably got the worst reviews off the bat since probably, or the most scathing one since Clockwork Orange. But I think it was really because of a misleading ad campaign. And I don't know if Kubrick did that himself, because it's set up, the ad campaign was all set up for this sexy thriller kind of thing. You know, are we going to get a money shot of Nicole Kidman kind of thing? And then we get this Kubrick film, which in a sense seems to be set back, you know, to almost a Great Gatsby kind of like era, at least psycho-emotionally. And, you know, looking to see a little flesh from Nicole Kidman, and they've got this book adopted from a book called Traum Novelle, and so let's talk about that film. You know, the very title of the book suggests that it's all a dream, and I'm not a big Tom Cruise fan, but I think this is his best role, because his natural kind of sort of sleepwalking persona works perfectly here. I mean, he's almost the Stepford doctor. Go ahead, Jeffrey or Darren, if you want to go in.
Darren, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Eyes Wide Shut is probably my favorite Kubrick film, which is strange because I loved all the showiness from 2001 and The Shining, but for some reason I think it's the themes in Eyes Shut that seems to really get to me every time I watch it. I seem to discover new things about it. So the meaning for that film for me has changed so much. It used to be kind of about sex, and then it was about dreams, and then now for me it's more to do with the kind of the fragile nature of the male ego, and how easily that can kind of be hurt, and then leads Tom Cruise on this whole journey trying to repair this slight emasculation that he's had during his conversation with his wife. And the length that he'll go to try and recover that satisfaction. So that's kind of where my thoughts are with that on the film. But I think you're right when you're talking about the marketing campaign for that film being about the exposure, the sex kind of thing, the way that they used to sell it. But it was sort of, the film really is so much more emotionally exposing for these raw characters, forcing them to look at their marriage and the truth about how they actually feel about each other. And it's a much more mature film than it is a perverted film.
Jeffrey?
You know, I wouldn't be surprised if Kubrick agreed to that advertising simply to mislead people and then get them in, disillusion them, and again, as a way of getting them to think, you know, there's something else besides sex. You know, we'll show you Nicole Kidman's ass right at the beginning of the film, and she's looking good, and she's naked. But that's not what this is about. As he said, and indeed is the case, that film is not about sex. It's about fidelity. It's about marriage, and it's about the challenges to fidelity. And I think it's very much a film that you'd expect an older Kubrick to make, and since I'm older, I can identify with that. You know, I'm not wise by any means, but I think I have greater wisdom now, sort of perspective on life and how things have to be taken, not to get too high or too low about anything, that life involves a lot of compromises and a lot of keeping a lot of different balls in the air at the same time. And I think what you get in Eyes Wide Shut is a very mature study of the challenges to what it means to pledge fidelity to someone else in spite of one's desires. It's very much an advance upon Humbert Humbert, who just gives in to his desires. And Tom Cruise, the main character, William Harford in the film, is someone who never actually cheats on his wife, but he thinks about it. And that raises the question, is thinking about it, is the desire itself a moral compromise? And if so, then you have to accept that we as beings are morally compromised, because everybody thinks about it and lots of people do it. And so it's an even more mature Kubrick consideration of what it means to be human in their relationships to other people, whether female or male. And I think finally it's also Kubrick's obviously final statement on the role of power, because unlike the novella, Kubrick introduces a character, Victor Ziegler, who represents the power elite who are manipulating everybody or attempting to manipulate everyone. And the fact that you have the mansion in which the orgy takes place is this obscene mansion that represents clear and mighty power. And that's very different from the modest bourgeois villa in which the orgy takes place in Schnitzler's novella. So again, it's a film that, like Paths of Glory and A Clockwork Orange, entertains the importance of the role of power that very powerful men and institutions have over most of the rest of us.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned Lolita, and there's the scene where is a shop owner, Cruise's character, his daughter, who's clearly a Lolita-esque, and
Yes.
actually
Yeah.
looks like a 12 or 13-year-old girl sex, and you know, going back to the prior film, Full Metal Jacket, you also get here the women are not many in number, but you do get the sense of the men scurrying around. So it almost reminded me of the men being sort of the humans in the original 1968 Planet of the Apes. They're these people who once had power but lost it, except the men don't seem to realize it, whereas the humans realize that they're outnumbered by the apes in the original Heston film.
And the best acting in that film is that long soliloquy that Nicole Kidman, has when she tells Bill, Tom Cruise, about her temptation to have sex with that naval officer. And it's just a bravura performance. It's around 11 minutes long. And she's just wonderful in it. And it shows the power of not only that particular actress in that particular role, but it represents the power of women and the power that women in particular have over men. And also the film is wonderful in terms, if you're looking for details, about how Kubrick presents the Freudian content of that film, because Schnitzler was a big follower of Freud, and they were colleagues. And Schnitzler was concerned with the same sorts of sexual dynamics that Freud was. Unlike Freud, Schnitzler was a gleeful cheater on everyone. He slept with women one after the other, and so I guess you'd call it research. He knew what he was writing about. But there's you may remember from the film, Bill is driving all around on this odyssey of desire, and he's driving from the Sonata Cafe, and then he's driving over to see the doctor, or to the costume shop, and then he reverses it through the rest of the film. And yet, if you look very carefully, you find that in the reflections of the glass as he approaches the doctor's office, or the costume maker's office, or renter's office, to get his costume to go to the orgy, reflected in the glass in the front of the building are all the signs of the Sonata Cafe. And so it turns out that he's taken, and this goes back to what Darren says about, is this all a dream, or is it all reality, or what, or is it both somehow? It turns out that he has taken a taxi across town to end up across the street from the Sonata Cafe. And that you can find by looking at the street sets, that he takes a taxi on several occasions, and he's always turning down the same street, which is a perfect representation of Freud's definition of neurosis. You keep doing the same thing without understanding what it is, so you keep doing the same thing. He's going nowhere in a sense. And yet at the end, you could argue it's a very positive film, because he and Alice have come to some sort of realization that they're tempted, and that there are these dreams and there are these challenges. And again, it's left open. Are they going to work it out, or aren't they? So it's a wonderfully deep film, and I've gotten to like it more and more each time I see it.
Darren, final comment on the film?
Yeah, one of the things I love about that, and this maybe ties in with the idea about this being a much more mature Kubrick at this point, is that the subject matter of this film is so much more intimate in terms of it's just a husband and wife dynamic. Whereas in 2001, he's taken on the evolution of the whole universe, and in Clockwork Orange, you're talking about all sorts of brainwashing and things. Whereas this is such a small, emotional, one-to-one person relationship dynamic that has a lot of psychological connections to each other and temptations. So it just feels like such a more intimate film, and I think for that reason it's so great to come back to because there's so much in that intimate environment that's kind of fleshed out in that film. I love the simplicity of that subject matter, but how he's constructed that within the film.
Well, let's end this segment and then we'll end the interview with just a few closing remarks and talk about Kubrick into the 21st century. But since you brought it up, Jeffrey, I just wanted to ask you a question regarding Kubrick and Freud, because one of the things that I think dates the films of Alfred Hitchcock is his over-reliance on this sort of early 20th, mid-20th century Freudian outlook. And I think that Kubrick had a much more sophisticated, if not total understanding, if not intuitive understanding of Freudian. For example, there are a lot of things that his practice and his stuff. But for example, I just looking at cultural memorabilia or whatnot, I look at like in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a lot of people who have these ideas that they were abducted by UFO aliens and sexually molested or something, or Satanists molesting people. These are such hyper Freudian things. And I think Kubrick understood this at a much deeper level than someone like Hitchcock. Have you ever thought about the difference between the way those two famous directors approached Freud and whatnot? Any comments, Jeffrey?
Well, I think you may well right that you mentioned it. On the other hand, I think you can take Dr. Strangelove and Vertigo, and if you look at the some of the essays of Slavoj Žižek, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's one of the great cultural critics of film, and he's written a study of Vertigo. In matter of fact, he's written a study of all of Hitchcock's film, but in Vertigo, he uses the work of Jacques Lacan, who's a post-Freudian theorist, who said that the unconscious is on the outside. It has to do with relationships and what people demand from each other. And instead of finding at the base of human discontents Freud's classic Oedipal conflict, he finds this deep fear of the death instinct within each one of us, our own drive toward mortality. And it turns out that Lacan's theory can be applied very successfully, I think, to both Vertigo and to Kubrick's films, Dr. Strangelove and Eyes Wide Shut. And again, this introduces the whole question of gender, because it is men that are particularly problematic in this regard. Women, too, have to face the same sort of confrontation with mortality as men. But men, for various reasons, cultural, social, political, sexual, have more difficulty with it in terms of their own identity as independent, active, dominant agents. And so I think while Hitchcock's use of Freud is limiting, I think also there were aspects of Hitchcock's use of Freud, like Kubrick's, that in fact really continue to bear fruit. And I would say in that sense, maybe Vertigo is an outlier. I think Vertigo is maybe Hitchcock's greatest film, and I think it's only lately been emerging as some sort of consensus on that. It was like Kubrick's films. I think originally people were disappointed by it, confused by it. I think it's because it's so deep. I think Vertigo is more like a Kubrick film than other Hitchcock films, which makes it deeper and better in my view.
Okay, well, let's end on that note, and when we get back, we'll wrap up the interview talking about Kubrick into the 21st century and final comments from both of our experts. We'll do that in a moment. All right, well, with Jeffrey Cox and Darren Foley talking about the life and career and films of Stanley Kubrick. let us wrap things up. But before I give each of you a final say, a statement on Kubrick, let's just talk about let's see, he died, I think, in '99, just right after the release of Eyes Wide Shut. So we've had over a decade and a half post Kubrick. Is there any filmmaker or yeah, well, a filmmaker that either of you see as Kubrickian, either in technical sense or in the subject matter? Let's start with you, Darren. Is there any filmmaker out there that you think is a direct descendant, really influenced by Kubrick?
I'm sure he probably influenced a lot of directors. I know Scorsese and Spielberg have talked about him a lot, and especially Spielberg having worked with them. But Paul Thomas Anderson's probably, he has a lot of Kubrick elements within his films, and there's even shots that pay a lot of homage to Kubrick moments in his films, like in There Will Be Blood. Like who's holding a bowling pin above his head is very similar to the Ape and the Dawn of Man sequence holding the bowling above his head. And there's lots of very similar framing iconic images, and then some even tonal links between There Will Be Blood and a few different Paul Thomas Anderson films. Even in Punch Drunk Love, there's a lot of one-point perspective shots that they use within that film that Kubrick was very familiar with. So I'd probably choose him with gratitude anyway.
How about you, Jeffrey? Is there anyone that has sort of the Kubrick themes or obsessiveness in certain ways?
No, but that may be a reflection of the fact that I'm still basically an historian rather than a film theorist, and I probably don't know enough about contemporary filmmaking, although I agree with what Darren said about Paul Thomas Anderson. He seems to have some of those substantive and formal qualities that might make him similar to Kubrick.
I know if you were to ask me who the greatest American filmmaker is, I would say it's either has to be Orson Welles or Stanley Kubrick. Would both of you agree on that?
Yes, except that you could argue that Kubrick really isn't just an American filmmaker.
Yeah. Okay. How about you, Dan?
I also like, I don't know, I was just thinking back of older films, like really old independent films, and maybe not American, but Untitled Chapter films, how the influence that he's had on film history and film theory and the way that films were told. I don't know, I'm just thinking of significant directors from before his time, probably those ones.
Well, do either of you have a final comment about Stanley Kubrick? Any final comment?
Just if I could throw out just a little resource if anybody was interested, there's a great podcast that people can listen to called Movie Geeks United, where the host interviews a lot of people who worked with Kubrick on different projects as producers or actors or all different sorts of jobs or assistants, many assistants, and they talk about the experience of working with them. And it's very contradictory to a lot of his reputation he gets as being this person who always has to be in control. And it's great to see that it sounds like he's really actually a very caring, open person who had this open ideology to ideas and wanted the best idea to end up on screen no matter who it came from. And it didn't always have to be him who was in charge. So this podcast is a really great resource, I think, to still learn a little bit more about him as a person, if anybody was interested.
Jeffrey, any final comment from you?
Well, in the pedagogical spirit of Kubrick's open narrative, let me give viewers of this video an assignment from The Shining. If you want to look in The Shining for the appearance in the background of 4 shots scattered throughout the bulk of the film of a rather famous item of kitsch, or actually a painting that has become a famous item of kitsch. Paul Peel's After the Bath, you've probably seen it. 2 naked little girls standing in front of a roaring fire, and people love it because it's so comforting and cute. And yet that painting appears in the shop, and the way that it's in different form and in different composition in each of the four that has psychological meaning. And you can find the same painting, the actual original that is in the art museum in Toronto. You can find that same painting in Atom Egoyan's film about the Armenian genocide, which is called, the title of that, Era. Egoyan uses that same painting to juxtapose people's memory of horrible events and their desire to suppress memory of those horrible events. And Kubrick uses a print of that painting in the Overlook Hotel to comment on the lifting of repression about the horrible realities of history and the problematics of our memory of what we've done to each other and how it affects us or doesn't affect us in the present. So take a look for that. See where you see it, because Kubrick put it there for a reason, I'm convinced.
Okay, well, thanks to both of you, and anyone wanting to find out more about Jeffrey's work or Darren's, links below here, the video to find about that. Last week I did a show on Eugene O'Neill, one of the titans of American theater. Now I've done one on one of the titans of film, and Stanley Kubrick. And next week, if you enjoyed that, I'm going to be doing a show on one of the titans of American television, Rod Serling, and one of the three guests will be one of his daughters, Ann Serling. So that should be an interesting show. So again, Jeffrey and Darren, thank you for your insights onto Stanley Kubrick, and for anyone who's watching this, hopefully you'll go out and check out the film. So thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.